Harry, really nice to be on the podcast with you this morning.
It's been a while, Sam.
Yeah, and I can't believe it's been 1 year since the Voice to Parliament referendum. We really did a lot of work in the lead up to that referendum, trying to break down the issues. We had a 5-part video explainer. We had a dedicated podcast. It doesn't feel in some ways like it was that long ago that we were having this national conversation. I also remember that night and the feeling of that night where a decision was reached so quickly on the broadcast, and we almost had this sense that this long count had been brought short. Can you remind everybody what the Voice to Parliament was?
So the Voice itself goes back to a call to action that was set out in the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. It was signed by nearly 250 First Nations leaders after years of what was called the Uluru Dialogues, which were regional, local and community-focused talks between First Peoples across Australia. So the Voice was meant to be a way of formally recognising First Nations people in the Constitution, and in practical terms, it would be an advisory body made up of First Nations people that would have a say on the laws and policies that impact their lives. And since it involved changing the Constitution, the whole country had to vote on it. And a year ago, Australia went to the polls, we all went to the polls, and it was defeated. 60% of the country said no, and around 40% said yes. And you're right, it only took 90 minutes after the polls closed for those results to be conclusive.
What I find really interesting about what we're talking about today is that referendum happened 12 months ago. The Uluru Statement is still there. It's still an important document in Australia. There are still people working on improving the rights, conditions, legislation around First Nations Australians. Has there been much change or movement on the actual Uluru Statement since the Voice?
So the Uluru Statement was a culmination of years of dialogue, and the actual statement itself still stands. And First Nations people are actively looking at developing the Uluru Statement and having Australians walk with them in this journey. And the Voice was the first of the 3 stages set out by the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and the next 2 were truth-telling and treaty. And on the night that he won the election, Anthony Albanese said he was fully committed to implementing the Statement from the Heart. So you could interpret that to be that he was promising all 3 stages of the Uluru Statement. So that's voice, truth and treaty.
Right, and we were doing a referendum just on that first bit.
Exactly, the very first stage. But after the referendum failed to get up, he hasn't been so clear on whether he'll go through the other 2 stages. And he recently said that it wasn't an option that's currently on the table. And that's why I wanted to speak to Professor Megan Davis, because she's a very esteemed constitutional lawyer. She campaigned in favour of the Voice, and she was actually the first person to read out the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017. We spoke about what's been going on since the referendum and what direction she believes the country's now going in. Professor Megan Davis, thank you so much for joining the Daily Aus.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So it's exactly 1 year since the referendum. To start off, how do you reflect on that period, the lead up with the campaign and the vote itself?
Oh, look, it's a bit of a blur, I think, for most people who are involved. It certainly was for me. I mean, I think in the lead up to the actual vote and the day, there was a lot of kind of hope and expectation, anticipation. People didn't really know what to think. And, of course, the polls weren't, at the end, didn't look positive. I think most of our people have really been grieving the result over the past year. I think people were devastated. That night, people were devastated. I just can remember, within an hour, the overwhelming no and just the wailing and the sobbing of our particular Uluru Dialogue campaign room. It was really devastating and still is to this day. But on the flip side, something that people used to say to me in the kind of darkest hours in the weeks after that we'd all forgotten was that there was 6.2 Aussies that voted yes. And that, made a really huge difference actually to everyone in the team and other mob right across the country just getting out of bed and getting moving again, that there was a really core group of Aussies who stood with us and understood what we were seeking to do, and accepted the invitation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But, I mean, it is a massive lost opportunity, Harry. Like, you know, when you look back on it, and I've been reading some reflections of lots of other mobs about the campaign and the day and what it means, it was a huge lost opportunity for the nation.
The idea from The Voice, which you've already mentioned, was the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, this had 3 requests, the first being The Voice, and then the 2 other requests to follow after a successful voice. Now that the first of those 3 steps has fallen over, will you still move forward with the other steps, even if the order's changed?
That's a difficult answer to give, because that's not how politics works, right? And the Uluru Statement isn't a kind of statement. It's not like, hey, here's an a la carte menu and this one's off the table now, so I have the next one. I mean, so voice doesn't fall away. That doesn't disappear just because of the no vote last year. Also, the broader framework of the Uluru Statement from the Heart stands. It was a new and innovative approach of First Nations peoples not to hand a petition to the Australian politicians, but to the Australian people to convince them and persuade them of the exigency of reform. And so I think it's really difficult to talk about the Uluru Statement when the media is not taking seriously the role that misinformation played in the campaign. If you look at the research post the vote, including essential research that has been recently published, the majority of Australians don't know about the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
I'm interested in your reflections on the political debate at the moment, because there's been a lot of questions put forward to the Prime Minister about whether he intends to follow through with the Makarrata Commission for Truth-Telling and Treaty. What are your reflections on those kind of discussions, given that, you know, you mentioned that politics doesn't work in a way that, you know, something like the Uluru Statement from the Heart can really cater for?
Well, politics can, but I think the lesson of the campaign is that you can't get change if you're going to go old school politics and expect politicians to get you to a yes. You know, it needs to be a proper people's movement. And if you don't have a people's movement, which is what the Uluru Statement was talking to when it asked Australians to walk with them, I think intuitively our people at The Rock knew that if it was just a traditional left versus right adversarial tussle between the LNP and Labor, it would end up exactly the way it ended up. So I think that's an important point. On the Prime Minister, you know, the Uluru Dialogue, we've been contacted since the referendum. So, you know, we see what everybody else sees in the media. I think an important issue that has been raised by some journalists, which is great, and a lot of mob, is that the Makarrata Commission was an election promise. It went through the Labor Policy Convention. It was a part of the election platform. It was costed. And so, you know, that is a broken promise, or maybe a broken promise subject to what happens after the election. That will be, you know, for the Australian people to judge. But, I mean, it was a policy.
In the years since, how would you characterise, you've touched on a few notes there, but how would you characterise progress on First Nations issues in Australia? Are there things that you're encouraged by, or are there things you're really concerned about?
So we started off the year with the Productivity Commission report, which was pretty scathing of the way in which Closing the Gap is rolling out, the lack of cooperation from states and territories, but in particular, the struggle that our people are having with the national bureaucracy in delivering on the things that our people have to deliver on to close the gap. And so one of the big key aspects of that Productivity Commission report was the fact that there's no federal voice, there's no legitimate voice that actually speaks in an authoritative way on behalf of communities that's guiding this work. And so that was really an important report, a difficult report also to read, only a few months after the no vote. But since then, we've seen similarly Closing the Gap reports come out showing next to no change. You know, things are in a very difficult space. I don't talk on behalf of all people. I know there's many mob involved in business and Indigenous procurement and other areas, but the work that I do is aimed at improving the lives of people who, might live in situations where structurally they need change to make a difference in their lives. I'm also a UN expert and international lawyer who's worked on self-determination. I helped draft the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So a big part of my work is oriented to how you get self-determination for our people and our communities. I think the Uluru Statement and the Voice still remain as exigent and relevant today as they were in 2017.
There will be an election sometime in the next 7 months for the federal parliament. What would a change of government at that level mean for the Uluru Statement?
A key point, Harry, here on this anniversary day is our job post-referendum has been to engage with the 6.2. That's a massive game changer because those people not just become advocates, but they walk alongside us, and that's very different to a reconciliation framework. It's very different to what's come before. And those 6.2 Australians live in 151 electorates, and they all vote, and they've all got family. We've got work to do to start yarning with Aussies who voted no and other Aussies. We are taking a different approach to achieving change, and that is, working with other Aussies quietly and now talking about what happened with the referendum, what we were trying to achieve, walking through the misinformation and all of those conversations that need to be had. And as I said, the enthusiasm of the 6.2 has been so overwhelming. It's really just been so gratifying and generous, and it's really helped our people get through a very, very difficult year. And so that's still political work. We are all political people with agency, all Australian citizens. And so that work in all of those federal elections will continue, and hopefully in time will lead to some change.
And as a final thought, what is your hope for the future of First Nations people in Australia?
Look, I think I have many hopes for our people. I think for me, I am a constitutional lawyer, so that's the way I think. But I think nothing changes, and I appreciate it's because I've studied constitutions for 20 years, but they really make a difference to people's lives. And I know that Australians often can't see that, but they do provide the material conditions for a dignified human life. And that has happened for most Australians in Australia. A lot of our structures, our rule of law flow as a consequence of that constitution, but there was one group excluded from that in 1901, and that was our people. And it was semi-corrected in 1967, but not fully. It allowed the federal parliament power to make laws for people of any race, and then they allowed us to be included in that. But it doesn't empower our people. And that's what structural change means. It's providing us with something that allows us to make a difference to our lives. And the Voice, as the option that went last year, was about compelling the state to listen to us. So what we said couldn't bind the parliament, because nothing can bind the parliament. Not even a treaty will bind a parliament. Nothing can in Australia's legal and political system. But it would at least allow us to table our views about particular things, and the media being the media would have reported on that. But at least Australians would start to get used to the views that we have on things, as opposed to politicians who seem to talk on our behalf all the time. So my hope is that we still march forward. Constitutional recognition is still important. Now, our people have always said we don't want symbolic recognition. We don't want tokenistic recognition. We want recognition that's going to make a difference to our people's lives. And the research shows Australians agree with that. So I'm not, I think at the end of the day, intuitively, up until a couple of months before the referendum, Aussies intuitively got what the Voice was about as a kind of pretty fair thing, that if it's a piece of legislation on Aboriginal people, we should have some input. Well, not me, but people chosen by the communities to represent them. And so who knows what goes forth, but I don't think that constitutional recognition can be off the table for a country like Australia. We will find our way back to there because constitutions matter. And I don't think we talk about that a lot in this country. I don't think constitutional literacy is particularly high because we don't do civics very well. But it's important, and it's important not just for us, it's important for all Australians. But it is important for our young people to see themselves recognised by the people, by the nation. And so I don't think that stops because of last year's referendum. No one's saying that to 4-year terms or the Republic.
And maybe just as a final verification, is it true that you had a little copy of the Constitution when you were a little bit younger and carried around with you?
I did have one when I was younger, and I think the Australian Story found me a copy of the one that I actually had as a kid. I think my little sister said to Australian Story that I carried it around like a nerd, but she was making trouble and trying to embarrass me on a national scale. But, I did. I was sick one day and my mum spent, most of her money on secondhand books, and we used to, love secondhand bookshops, and that's where she found a particular book. It had a copy of the Constitution in it, and I was really mesmerised. I think partly because I loved Australian politics. We were really poor. We lived in a housing commission home. We were underclass, and my mum was always like, Australian politics is what dictates our lives from election to election. And then I got to University of Queensland and studied my first political theory subject. I hated it. I never took the subjects again. So I think studying it just took the joy out of it for me.
Well, we never know, Professor Megan Davies. There might be more little kids out there carrying around a Constitution in the future.
I hope so, because as I keep saying to all the Uluru youth, the Constitution's built to change. We can't be intimidated by it or the Australian people. We've got a bit of work to do on politicians, but I think it is built to change. The drafters wanted it to change with the times, and I just think as a nation we've just got to get better at how we do that.
Professor Megan Davies, thank you so much for joining the Daily Aus.